The settlement of Riverhaven clung to the edge of Montana Territory like a desperate prayer, its wooden buildings weathered by winter storms and summer drought, its people hardened by isolation and unforgiving land. In the shadow of the towering pines that surrounded the settlement's perimeter, beneath skies vast enough to swallow hope whole, a woman waited on auction steps with her wrists bound, not with rope, but with the invisible chains of a community's judgment. And in the darkness beyond the torchlight, a stranger watched, his eyes reflecting a dangerous truth. Some battles are worth fighting, even when the entire world stands against you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dusk settled over Riverhaven like a shroud, painting the rough-hewn buildings in hues of amber and blood. The spring thaw had come early, turning the main thoroughfare into a treacherous ribbon of mud that sucked at boots and wagon wheels with equal hunger. Lanterns flickered to life along the settlement's single street, illuminating the weathered sign of Henderson's General Store, the blacksmith's anvil silent for the day, and the crude wooden cross atop the chapel where Reverend Thatcher preached salvation each Sunday with spittle-flecked fervor. At the center of the settlement stood the meeting hall, its wide steps serving as an impromptu stage where the business of Riverhaven was conducted in full view of any who cared to watch. Today a crowd had gathered, their faces grim beneath worn hats and woolen shawls. A tall man in a frayed black coat cleared his throat importantly, unfurling a document sealed with wax and ribbon. Magistrate Norton's voice carried across the hushed gathering with practiced authority. "By order of the Territorial Court," he announced, squinting at the parchment, "the estate of the late Ezekiel Montgomery, including all properties, livestock, land claims and dependent persons, is hereby offered for public settlement of outstanding debts." A murmur rippled through the assembled settlers. Men shifted uneasily, adjusting hat brims to shield their expressions. Women clutched at shawls and children's shoulders, their knuckles white with tension. Standing apart from the crowd, positioned at the edge of the steps like an afterthought, was Hannah Montgomery. Her copper hair, once her pride, hung in a simple braid down her back, dulled by months of grief and neglect. The black mourning dress she wore hung loose on her frame, testament to meals missed and nights spent sleepless. Despite the indignity of her position, her spine remained straight, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the settlement's boundaries. The bruise on her cheek, fading now to sickly yellow, told a story few dared acknowledge. "First item," Norton continued, gesturing expansively, "the Montgomery homestead, comprising 80 acres of cleared land, a 3-room cabin, barn and outbuildings." The bidding began cautiously, then gathered momentum as the men of Riverhaven calculated the value of another man's life work. When the price was settled, Norton moved methodically through the list. Tools, livestock, furniture, even Ezekiel's pocket watch, passed down through generations, now reduced to a handful of coins. Hannah watched it all with detached resignation, as if observing a scene from great distance. These things had never truly been hers, even in marriage. Why should their loss touch her now? Then Norton cleared his throat, a note of discomfort entering, his officious tone for the first time. "Final item," he said, "custody and care of Hannah Montgomery, widow, aged 26. A silence fell so profound that the creak of leather and the stamp of horses at the hitching posts seemed thunderous by comparison. Hannah's gaze finally dropped from the horizon to the muddy ground at her feet. This was the moment she had dreaded. Since Ezekiel's death, since before, if truth be told, a woman alone in frontier territory was a burden, a liability, a problem to be solved, and Hannah Montgomery was more problematic than most. "As you know," Norton continued, discomfort evident in his shifting stance, "Mrs. Montgomery has no family. In the territory, No brothers or father to claim responsibility. According to settlement law, she must be placed under male guardianship. He coughed delicately. Any man of good standing may offer to take responsibility. No hands raised, no voices called out. The gathered crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath. Rebecca Wilson, the miller's wife, leaned toward her companion and whispered not quietly enough, "They say she killed him, you know. Ezekiel poisoned his tea after he caught her with those strange herbs. Witchcraft," another woman muttered, making a sign against evil. "My Thomas saw her down by the creek at full moon, talking to herself. Unnatural." Hannah's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes fixed on the ground. The accusations were familiar. Wounds reopened daily since Ezekiel's sudden collapse 2 months prior. No one had questioned when the beloved, God-fearing pillar of Riverhaven fell dead in his own fields. At first. Then the whispers began. Hannah's knowledge of herbs and remedies, learned from her grandmother, once sought after by women in childbed, or families with fever, became something sinister. Her quiet nature, her lack of children after 5 years of marriage, her preference for solitude, all transformed into evidence of something malevolent. "Come now," Norton said, discomfort-giving. "Way to impatience. She's able-bodied, can cook and keep house. Educated too, reads and ciphers." His gaze swept the crowd. "Surely someone has need of such skills." A derisive laugh, quickly stifled, came from somewhere in the gathering. "Not if she comes with a curse," someone called. The Reverend Thatcher stepped forward, Bible clutched to his narrow chest. "Perhaps the church should take responsibility," he said, his eyes never quite meeting Hannah's. "We might help the woman find redemption through proper guidance and discipline." Hannah's fingers curled into fists hidden in the folds of her skirt. She knew what awaited her under Thatcher's guidance. Accusations disguised as prayers, suspicious eyes watching her every move, a life constrained to penitence for crimes she hadn't committed. "A living death, a generous offer," Norton acknowledged. "Does anyone wish to counter Reverend Thatcher's proposal?" Silence stretched thin as spider silk, ready to snap under the weight of collective judgment. Hannah closed her eyes briefly. She had known this would happen, had prepared herself as best she could. Yet the reality of standing before the entire settlement, being auctioned like an unwanted cow, cut deeper than she had imagined possible. Then, from the edge of the torchlight, came the sound of heavy boots on wooden planks, a collective intake of breath swept through the crowd as a figure emerged from the shadows and approached the steps with unhurried purpose. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the easy strength of a man accustomed to physical labor. A dark hat pulled low obscured much of his face, but couldn't hide the jagged scar that ran from temple to jaw on the left side, pulling his mouth into a permanent half-grimace. His coat, good quality leather worn soft with age, hung open to reveal a pistol at his hip. No rifle, but something in his bearing suggested he hardly needed one. Recognition rippled through the crowd in anxious whispers. "Gabriel North," someone hissed, the name carrying the weight of both fear and fascination. Hannah had heard of North. Everyone in 3 territories had. The lone rancher who'd claimed land in the shadow of Wolf's Head Mountain, land no one else wanted or dared to settle. Stories circulated about his past, that he'd been an army scout, a bounty hunter, an outlaw, that he'd killed 12 men, or 24, that native tribes respected him enough to leave his herds untouched during raids, that wolves avoided his territory. One story Hannah knew to be true. Gabriel North kept to himself and expected others to do the same. In the 4 years since he'd established his ranch, he'd come to Riverhaven no more than a handful of times, speaking only when necessary, never lingering. He had no friends in the settlement, no connections, no reason to be here today. And yet, here he stood. North said nothing as he approached the steps. He simply raised his hand, a single finger extended in clear intent. Norton swallowed visibly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. You wish to bid, Mr. North? A single sharp nod. The magistrate glanced nervously at Reverend Thatcher, whose thin face had flushed dark with indignation. The Reverend has offered the church's protection. I'll pay her husband's remaining debts, North said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet. All of them. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Ezekiel Montgomery's debts, gambling losses, failed investments, loans taken against future harvests that never materialized, amounted to more money than most settlers would see in years. Everyone had assumed they would go unpaid, written off as the cost of frontier business. That's, Norton consulted his ledger with trembling fingers, that's $178. North reached inside his coat and produced a leather pouch. He tossed it casually onto the steps, where it landed with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. 180, he said. Keep the extra. Reverend Thatcher stepped forward, Bible clutched to his chest like a shield. This is most irregular. Mrs. Montgomery requires proper guidance, not— Do you mean to outbid me, Reverend? North interrupted, his voice deceptively soft. The challenge hung in the air between them. Everyone present knew the church's coffers couldn't match North's offer, and everyone, including Thatcher, knew that North was fully aware of this fact. The Reverend's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he stepped back, fury and impotence warring on his narrow face. No further bids? Norton asked, his voice higher than usual. When silence answered him, he struck his gavel against the railing with a crack that made Hannah flinch. Sold to Mr. North. A rush of conflicting emotions washed over Hannah. Relief that she had escaped Thatcher's clutches, terror at the unknown fate awaiting her, and beneath it all, a curious spark of something dangerously close to hope. She'd heard the stories about Gabriel North, yes, but she had also seen him once, 2 summers past, interceding when a local farmer was beating his horse in the street. North had said little, done less, merely placed himself between the animal and the raised whip, but something in his quiet authority had forced the other man to back down. North approached her now with that same measured certainty. He stopped before her, close enough that she could smell leather and wood smoke, could see the varied greys in his eyes, not cold, as rumor had it, but watchful, assessing. For a long moment he simply looked at her, as if searching for something. In her face, Hannah met his gaze steadily, refusing to show the fear churning in her stomach. Without warning, North turned away from her and addressed the crowd, his voice carrying easily across the sudden hush. Anyone who comes to my land uninvited, he said, each word deliberate and weighted, will be treated as a trespasser. His gaze swept the gathering, settling briefly on Thatcher. That includes men of God. With that, he turned back to Hannah and inclined his head slightly, not a command, but an invitation. Though every instinct screamed caution, Hannah stepped forward. She had no illusions about her situation. The choice wasn't between safety and danger. There was no safety for her in Riverhaven, not anymore. The choice was between familiar danger and unknown possibility. North led her to where a large black horse waited patiently at the hitching post. Without fanfare, he mounted, then extended his hand down to her. Hannah hesitated, acutely aware of the eyes watching her, the judgments being formed, the stories that would grow from this moment. Then she placed her hand in his palm calloused but his grip careful, and allowed him to lift her effortlessly onto the saddle before him. As the horse turned away from the settlement, Hannah felt North's voice close to her ear. Too quiet for anyone else to hear. I won't hurt you. 3 simple words, a promise, an assurance, perhaps even a kindness. Hannah didn't respond. Promises were easy to make, harder to keep. She had learned that lesson well in her years with Ezekiel. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the winding trail ahead as North guided the horse away from Riverhaven, away from the only life she had known for 5 years. Behind them, torchlight gave way to darkness. Before them stretched an uncertain path. Hannah sat stiffly in the saddle, conscious of North's solid presence at her back, his arms forming a protective cage around her without touching her directly. The gesture, like the man himself, was a contradiction, offering security without demanding surrender. They rode in silence as Riverhaven vanished behind them, swallowed by the vastness of Montana territory. The night air carried the scent of pine and distant snowmelt. Stars emerged overhead, indifferent to the small dramas unfolding beneath their ancient light. Hannah felt something loosen in her chest, with each beat of the horse's hooves against the earth. Not relief, not yet, but the first breath after too long underwater. She did not know Gabriel North, did not know what awaited her at his isolated ranch, what price he would expect for his unexpected intervention. But as Riverhaven disappeared into the darkness behind them, Hannah allowed herself to acknowledge one simple truth. Whatever lay ahead couldn't possibly be worse than what she left behind. The horse followed a game trail invisible to Hannah's eyes, winding deeper into the wilderness that surrounded Riverhaven. North guided the animal with minimal direction, his body shifting subtly with each change in terrain. They crossed a shallow creek, water splashing against the horse's legs, then began a gradual climb into foothills dressed in pine and fir. Moon rose, casting silver light across the landscape. After what felt like hours, the trees opened into a natural clearing. In the moonlight, Hannah could make out the silhouette of a substantial log cabin, larger than most in the settlement, with a wide porch and chimney of fitted stone. Behind it stood a barn and several outbuildings, the boundaries of corrals stretching into shadow. It wasn't the primitive outpost rumors had described, but a proper homestead, well established and maintained. North reined the horse to a stop before the cabin. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he dismounted in one fluid motion and turned to help her down. Hannah slid from the saddle on her own, legs stiff from the long ride. If North was offended by her refusal of assistance, he gave no sign, merely nodded and led the horse toward the barn. "Wait inside," he said, gesturing toward the cabin. "I'll see to my horse." Hannah hesitated, eyeing the dark building warily. North seemed to read her thoughts. "Door's not locked," he said. "Never is." With that, he disappeared into the shadows of the barn, leading the tired horse. Hannah stood alone in the clearing, considering her options. She could run, though where she would go, how she would survive, she couldn't say. She could refuse to enter, stand her ground here in the yard until North returned. Or she could proceed as instructed, enter the unknown space, assert what little agency remained to her. Straightening her shoulders, Hannah approached the cabin. The door opened at her touch, hinges silent and well-oiled. Inside, darkness awaited, profound and complete. She stood on the threshold, blind, every nerve taut with apprehension. A rustling sound from behind startled her, and she whirled to find North approaching with a bundle under one arm. Without comment, he reached past her, careful not to touch her, and struck a match. The sudden flare illuminated his scarred face for an instant before he touched the flame to a lamp hanging beside the door. Warm light bloomed, revealing the cabin's interior. Hannah's breath caught. She had expected. Rugged simplicity at best, primitive squalor at worst. What she saw instead defied all expectations. The cabin consisted of one large room with a massive stone fireplace at its center. The furnishings were sparse but finely crafted, a solid table of polished wood, chairs with curved backs, shelves lined with books. Most surprising of all was the cleanliness, no dust, no disorder, everything in its place. North moved past her to light a fire in the hearth, his movements efficient and practiced. Hannah remained near the door, uncertain of her place in this unexpected setting. "There's food in the larder," North said, without looking up from his task. "Water in the bucket by the sink." Hannah found her voice at last. "Why?" she asked, the single word containing all her confusion, suspicion, and bewilderment. North paused, one hand resting on the mantel. The firelight caught the edges of his profile, softening the harshness of his scar. "You needed help," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "You don't know me," Hannah countered, wariness battling with curiosity. "I know enough." He turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "I know what it is to be judged by people who see only what they want to see." The words hung between them, heavy with implications Hannah couldn't fully decipher. Before she could respond, North gestured toward a door at the back of the room. "You can sleep there," he said. "It locks from inside." He crossed to a chest near the fireplace and withdrew blankets and a bundle of cloth, which he placed on the table between them. "Clean clothes," he explained. "They'll be too large, but they're dry." Hannah stared at the offering. "Where will you sleep?" North nodded toward a ladder leading to a loft. "Up there, or out in the barn. Your choice." Her choice. The concept was so foreign that Hannah almost laughed. When had anything in her life been her choice? Not her marriage to Ezekiel, arranged by a father anxious to see his troublesome daughter settled before he died. Not her isolation in Riverhaven, cut off from family and friends. Certainly not the whispers and accusations that had followed Ezekiel's death. North seemed to read her thoughts. "No one owns you here," he said quietly. "Not me, not anyone." Hannah's throat tightened unexpectedly. "Until when?" she asked, hating the tremor in her voice. North turned away, attending to the fire once more. "Until you decide otherwise," he said to the flames. Hannah stood frozen, trying to make sense of his words, his actions, the entire inexplicable situation. None of it fit the stories she'd heard about Gabriel North, the dangerous recluse. None of it aligned with her experience of men in general who took what they wanted and gave little in return. As the fire caught properly, sending warmth stealing across the room, North straightened and moved toward the door. "I'll see to the animals," he said. "Take what you need." And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Hannah alone in the warmth and light of a stranger's home. She didn't move immediately, half expecting him to return, to reveal some hidden agenda or expectation. When minutes passed and the door remained closed, she approached the table cautiously and examined the bundle he had left. The clothes were simple but of good quality. A man's shirt, soft with washing, and wool trousers. There was even a comb and a sliver of soap tucked into the folds. Hannah touched these items with wonder, recognizing them as the small dignities. They were not luxuries, but basic human necessities that had been denied her in the chaos following Ezekiel's death. Suspicion warred with desperate gratitude as Hannah carried the bundle into the small room North had indicated. A narrow bed with a proper frame and mattress occupied one wall. A washstand with basin and pitcher stood nearby. As promised, the door had a sturdy bolt that slid easily into place. Hannah sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day crashing over her in a wave of delayed reaction. She had begun the morning as a widow under suspicion, facing public auction and the hostile custody of Reverend Thatcher. She would end it in a stranger's home, miles from anything familiar, her future as uncertain as ever. But perhaps, for the first time in years, with a whisper of something she scarcely recognized. Choice. Outside, the Montana night enveloped the clearing in primal darkness. Inside, Hannah Montgomery wrapped her arms around herself and allowed silent tears to fall, not from fear or despair, but from the dangerous, fragile feeling blooming in her chest that might, if she dared name it, be called hope. Dawn arrived, with tentative fingers of light creeping through the small window. Hannah woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was. The unfamiliar comfort of a real mattress, the clean smell of the blankets, these sensations belonged to another life, before Ezekiel's gambling had forced them to sell most of their possessions. She sat up slowly, listening for sounds beyond. The bolted door. The cabin was quiet, save for the soft crackle of a freshly tended fire. Hannah rose and dressed quickly in her own clothes, unwilling to accept North's offerings just yet. She splashed cold water on her face from the basin, smoothed her copper hair as best she could, and with a deep breath slid back the bolt. The main room was empty, but evidence of North's presence remained. Fresh coffee bubbling in a pot by the fire, a loaf of bread and a crock of butter on the table. Hannah hesitated, then helped herself to a small portion, the first real food she'd had in days. As she ate, she examined her surroundings more carefully in the morning light. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled not with the expected practical. Manuals on farming or hunting, but with volumes of history, philosophy and literature. A desk beneath the window held papers arranged in neat stacks. Above the fireplace hung a single painting, a mountain landscape executed with surprising skill. Nothing in the cabin matched the rumors of the dangerous, primitive recluse she'd heard described in Riverhaven. The door opened, and North entered carrying an armful of split wood. He nodded a greeting but said nothing as he stacked the logs neatly beside the hearth. In daylight, he seemed less intimidating, though no less imposing. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and the scar on his face was an old one, long-healed. Hannah judged him to be in his late 30s, though weathering from years in the elements made precise age difficult to determine. "Thank you," Hannah said, the words awkward on her tongue. "For the food and the room." North acknowledged her, gratitude with a slight inclination of his head. "There's work to be done," he said, his voice as measured as his movements. "But not by you. Not yet. Rest today." Hannah bristled at this presumption. "I'm not an invalid, Mr. North." A flicker of something, amusement perhaps, crossed his face. "No," he agreed, "but you've been through an ordeal, and my name is Gabriel." Before she could respond, he turned toward the door. "I'll be tending the south pasture, back by sundown. There's stew in the pot for midday meal." With that, he was gone, leaving Hannah alone once more in the strange sanctuary of his home. She stood in the center of the room, uncertain what to do with this unexpected gift of time and solitude. After months of being watched, judged, and eventually shunned by the people of Riverhaven, the absence of suspicious eyes felt both liberating and disconcerting. Hannah spent the morning exploring the cabin's immediate surroundings, never straying too far. The clearing was larger than it had appeared in darkness, with the main house and outbuildings forming a rough semicircle at its northern edge. Behind the cabin, a vegetable garden showed signs of recent care, though it was clear North was no farmer. The plantings were practical but basic: potatoes, beans, hardy greens that could survive the mountain climate. Beyond the garden, a path led through trees to a small, spring-fed pond. Its surface mirrored the sky perfectly, undisturbed by the slightest breeze. Hannah knelt at its edge, studying her reflection for the first time in weeks. The face that looked back at her was thinner than she remembered, with shadows beneath, her eyes and tension around her mouth. She touched the fading bruise on her cheek, Ezekiel's final gift to her, delivered in drunken rage the night before his death. "I didn't kill you," she whispered to the memory that haunted her watching. Ripples disrupt her reflection. "But I confess I didn't mourn you either." The admission, spoken aloud for the first time, seemed to lift a weight she hadn't realized she carried. Ezekiel Montgomery had not been the husband of her choosing, nor had he been the God-fearing pillar of the community he'd presented himself as. Behind closed doors, he'd been a different man entirely, jealous, controlling, quick to anger, and slow to forgive. His death had been sudden but natural, his heart giving out after years of abuse to his body. The settlement's suspicion of her had been convenient, a way to avoid examining too closely the character of a man they'd chosen to admire. Hannah returned to the cabin as the sun reached its zenith. She ate some of the promised stew, surprisingly well-seasoned and hearty, then turned her attention to the bookshelves. Among the volumes, she found a collection of poetry by Wordsworth. She opened it carefully, remembering similar editions. In her father's library years before, the discovery of this unexpected connection to her past life brought tears to her eyes. Hannah settled in a chair by the window, losing herself in words nearly forgotten. She was still there, book in hand, when shadows lengthened across the clearing, announcing evening's approach. The distant sound of hoofbeats roused her from literary reverie. North was returning. She set the book aside and moved to the fireplace, stoking the banked embers to prepare for the evening chill. It was a small gesture of reciprocity, an acknowledgement of the unexpected kindness she'd been shown. When North entered, leading with a string of freshly caught trout, he paused at the sight of her by the hearth. "You found something to read," he observed, nodding toward the book she'd left open. Hannah nodded. "I hope you don't mind." Books are meant to be read. He moved to the sink, beginning to clean the fish with practiced efficiency. Wordsworth. "Good choice." The casual comment surprised her. "You're familiar with his work." North's hands didn't pause in their task. "Nature never did betray the heart that loved her," he quoted softly. Hannah stared at him, trying to reconcile this man who could quote romantic poetry while gutting fish with the fearsome figure of settlement rumor. The contradiction was becoming a pattern, she realized. Everything about Gabriel North defied expectation. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked abruptly. North continued his work, seemingly untroubled by the direct question. "Why did you come?" he countered. "I had no choice." "You had the same choice I did once," he said, his voice neutral. "Stay and be judged by those who never intended to see you clearly, or leave and find some place where the weight of others' expectations doesn't crush the breath from your lungs." The accuracy of his assessment struck Hannah silent. She watched as he finished preparing the fish, considering the implication behind his words. "Is that why you live here alone?" North wiped his hands on a cloth. "I'm not always alone," he said, "but I choose who crosses my threshold, and you chose me," Hannah pressed, needing to understand. "Why?" North turned to face her fully, his grey eyes studying her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. "Because a woman who plants wolfsbane to protect her garden, not to poison her husband, deserves better than to be condemned by ignorance." Hannah's breath caught. "You knew." "I make it my business to know what happens in 3 days' ride of my land," North said simply. "And I've spent enough time with the Blackfoot to recognize medicinal plantings. When I see them," relief washed through Hannah, the simple, profound relief of being believed. For months, she had lived under the shadow of unspoken accusations, with no one willing to consider that her knowledge of plants might be innocent, that Ezekiel's death might be nothing more than the natural consequence of his own excesses. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for the gift he'd given her. North nodded once, then turned back to preparing their meal. They worked together in companionable silence, Hannah setting the table while North cooked the fish with surprising skill. When they sat to eat, the quiet between them had transformed from awkward to peaceful. After the meal, as Hannah washed the dishes, North brought a leather satchel to the table. "These belong to your grandmother," he said, opening it to reveal Bundles of dried herbs and small glass bottles. The sheriff was going to burn them as evidence. Seemed a waste. Hannah approached cautiously, scarcely believing what she saw. Her grandmother's remedies, the knowledge passed down through generations of women in her family, preserved despite Riverhaven's fear and suspicion. She touched the herbs reverently, recognizing each by scent and texture. "How did you get these?" she asked, looking up at North with wonder. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Let's just say Sheriff Daniels found my arguments persuasive." Hannah narrowed her eyes. "You threatened him." "I reasoned with him," North corrected. With emphasis. Despite herself, Hannah felt laughter bubble up. The first genuine laughter she'd experienced in longer than she could remember. The sound seemed to surprise them both. North's expression softened momentarily, revealing a glimpse of the younger man he must have been before life carved that scar into his face, and the solemnity into his bearing. The moment passed quickly, but its effect lingered as Hannah carefully examined each item in the satchel. Most were common medicinals, feverfew for headaches, valerian for sleep, arnica for bruises, but some were rarer, gathered from mountain slopes and hidden valleys. "My grandmother taught me their uses when I was a girl," Hannah explained, arranging. "The bottles, by purpose. The women of Riverhaven used to come to me when they needed help, with monthly pains, difficult births, children's fevers. Until they needed someone to blame," North finished. Hannah nodded. "It's easier to believe in witchcraft than to accept that sometimes people simply die, despite our best efforts. Or that respected men might not deserve the respect they're given," North added, his perceptiveness once again catching Hannah off guard. She looked up at him, really seeing him for perhaps the first time. "What happened to your face?" she asked directly, curiosity overcoming propriety. If he was offended by the blunt question, he didn't show it. "Grizzly," he said simply. 8 years ago, I survived." She didn't. The lack of embellishment told Hannah more than flowery explanations. Could have. This was a man who neither boasted of his scars nor hid from them. They simply were, like the mountains or the changing seasons, facts of existence to be acknowledged and accommodated. "Is that when you came here?" she asked. North nodded. "After. There was a time between." Something in his tone suggested that time between held stories he wasn't yet ready to share. Hannah didn't press. She understood boundaries, the need for private sorrows. As night deepened around the cabin, Hannah helped North store her grandmother's remedies in a small cabinet he cleared for the purpose. The simple act of organizing these connections to her past helped ground her in this strange new present. When they finished, North once again retreated to the barn, leaving Hannah the privacy of the cabin without discussion or negotiation. Hannah, gesture like so many he'd made, acknowledged her autonomy without fanfare. In the small bedroom, door unbolted this time, Hannah changed into the clothes North had provided. The shirt hung loose on her frame, but the clean fabric felt like a luxury against her skin. She slid beneath the blankets and stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the dramatic shift in her circumstances. Yesterday she had been a widow under suspicion, facing a future of servitude and scorn. Tonight, she lay in a clean bed, in the home of a man who had shown her nothing but respect, surrounded by the tools of her grandmother's healing traditions, with no immediate demands placed upon her. The transformation was so complete, so unexpected, that Hannah struggled to trust it, yet as sleep claimed her, one thought persisted. For the first time since her father had announced her betrothal to Ezekiel 6 years earlier, Hannah Montgomery had been seen, truly seen, for who she was, not who others needed her to be. That recognition, offered without expectation by a scarred recluse who had his own reasons for understanding the value of fair judgment, felt dangerously like the beginning of freedom. Outside, the Montana night embraced the clearing, stars wheeling. overhead in ancient patterns. From the barn came the occasional soft sound of horses shifting in their stalls. In the forest beyond, an owl called once, then fell silent. The world continued its eternal rhythms, indifferent to the small dramas of human lives. But within the circle of North's homestead, something fragile had begun to take root, a tentative trust between two people who had learned the hard way that appearances rarely told the whole truth, and that sometimes the most profound acts of courage happened in ordinary moments, witnessed by no one. The days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Hannah rose with the sun, preparing breakfast, while North tended to the livestock. They ate together in companionable silence before North departed to work his land, checking boundary lines, mending fences, tracking the movement of his small cattle herd across the mountain pastures. Hannah, initially uncertain of her place, gradually took responsibility for the garden, finding peace in the familiar work of coaxing life from soil. April gave way to May, bringing warmer days and explosive growth to the wilderness surrounding North's homestead. Wildflowers carpeted hidden meadows, and the forest floor turned emerald with new ferns unfurling beneath the pines. Hannah expanded the herb garden, transplanting medicinal specimens she found during careful explorations of the surrounding area. North observed her growing collection with quiet approval, occasionally bringing her specimens he'd discovered on his longer rides: elderflower for fevers, wild ginger for stomach complaints, resinous pine buds for salves. He never questioned her knowledge or methods, simply accepting her skill as something valuable rather than suspicious. "Where did you learn to ride?" North asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching twilight settle over the clearing. The question broke nearly an hour of comfortable silence. Hannah smiled faintly at the memory. "My father raised horses in Virginia before the war. When I was a girl, he taught me everything he knew, against my mother's wishes, of course. Ladies weren't supposed to ride astride or understand breeding lines." "Your father sounds like an unusual man," North observed. "He was," Hannah agreed, "too unusual for many. After the war took everything, he brought what remained of our stock west, determined to start again. But the consumption took him before he could truly rebuild." She paused, remembering her father's fierce independence, his refusal to bow to convention. "I inherited his stubbornness, or so my mother always claimed." North's mouth quirked in what Hannah had come to recognize as his version of a smile. "I believe it." The following morning, Hannah woke to find North leading a dappled grey mare into the yard. The horse was young, spirited but not unmanageable, with intelligent eyes and clean lines that spoke of quality breeding. "She needs exercise," North said when Hannah approached, offering the simple explanation as if lending a valuable horse were an everyday occurrence. "And I could use help checking the North Ridge today." Hannah recognized the gift disguised as practical need, just as she recognized the trust implicit in the invitation to accompany him beyond the immediate boundaries of the homestead. She accepted both with a nod, disappearing into the cabin to change into the riding clothes North had provided weeks earlier, sturdy trousers and a flannel shirt she'd altered to fit her smaller frame. They rode out as morning mist still clung to the valleys, the grey mare responding eagerly to Hannah's gentle guidance. North led them along game trails that twisted through stands of lodgepole pine and across flowering meadows, gradually climbing toward higher elevations. He rode slightly ahead but frequently glanced back, his expression softening when he saw Hannah's evident joy in the freedom of movement, the communion with a responsive horse. Near midday, they reached a ridge overlooking a vast expanse of wilderness. Below them stretched miles of untamed country, forested slopes giving way to distant peaks still capped with snow, a silver ribbon of river winding through the valley floor. North dismounted at a natural clearing and tethered his horse to a young aspen. "We'll rest here," he said, helping Hannah from her saddle despite her protests that she needed no assistance. The brief contact of his hands at her waist sent an unexpected warmth through her, quickly suppressed. From his saddlebag, North produced a simple lunch: bread, cheese, dried apple slices. They ate in silence, gazing out at the panorama spread before them. The immensity of the landscape made human concerns seem temporary, insignificant. "This is why you stay," Hannah said finally, understanding dawning. "This is what you're protecting." North nodded. "Not just the land, what it represents." He gestured toward the horizon. "Out there, a person can be judged by their actions, not by rumors or appearances. Nature doesn't care about your past, only how you meet each day as it comes." Hannah studied his profile. The way the scar pulled slightly at the corner of his mouth, the quiet intensity in his grey eyes as he surveyed his domain. "Yet you rescued me from Riverhaven," she observed. "You involved yourself in their judgment. Some judgments can't go unchallenged," he replied simply. Before Hannah could respond, North tensed, his head turning sharply toward the trail they had followed. "Someone's coming," he said, voice dropping to just above a whisper. In one fluid motion, he moved to his horse and withdrew a rifle from its scabbard. Hannah listened, but heard nothing beyond the whisper of wind through the pines and the occasional call of a jay. Then, faintly, she caught the rhythm of approaching hoofbeats. Multiple riders, moving with purpose. North positioned himself between Hannah and the trail, rifle held ready but not yet raised. "Stay behind me," he instructed, his tone allowing no argument. 3 riders emerged from the tree line. Sheriff Daniels from Riverhaven, flanked by 2 men Hannah recognized as merchants from the settlement. They pulled their horses to a halt when they spotted North, wariness evident in their postures. "North!" the sheriff acknowledged, touching the brim of his hat. His gaze shifted to Hannah, standing partially obscured behind North's broader frame. "Mrs. Montgomery." "Sheriff," North replied, his voice deceptively calm. "You're a long way from Riverhaven." Daniel's hand rested casually near his holstered pistol. "Official business. We've been tracking a band of horse thieves working this area. Thought you might have seen something." The tension in North's shoulders didn't ease. "No thieves on my land, Sheriff. I'd know." One of the merchants, Jenkins, Hannah recalled, who owned the dry goods store, leaned forward in his saddle. "Heard you acquired a new mare recently," he said, eyes fixed on Hannah's grey. "Fine animal, unusual markings." "I acquire horses regularly," North replied evenly. "It's my business." "Funny coincidence," Jenkins continued. "Walcott Ranch lost a breeding mare with similar coloring last month, worth a fair price, too." The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Hannah felt her pulse quicken with indignation. These men hadn't come tracking thieves. They'd come looking for an excuse to reclaim her, using the mare as pretense. North's expression didn't change, but Hannah sensed the dangerous shift in his demeanor. "That mare," he said, nodding toward. "Hannah's horse was bred on my land, foaled 3 springs past. Her dam stands in my stable, her sire's papers are in my desk. I'd be happy to compare her marking to any Walcott claims to have lost." Sheriff Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "No need for that, North, just doing due diligence." "Are you?" North's voice had grown softer, more dangerous. "Or are you satisfying Reverend Thatcher's curiosity about Mrs. Montgomery's welfare?" The sheriff had the grace to look embarrassed. The Reverend expressed concerns. "Mrs. Montgomery is under my protection," North interrupted, the rifle in his hands making the statement more than a simple declaration. "She stays by her choice. Any man who attempts to interfere with that choice will answer to me." The second merchant, Williams, a heavy-set man who ran the sawmill, spat into the dirt. "Told you he'd claim her proper," he muttered to Jenkins. "Man living alone this long, stands to reason he'd jump at the chance." Hannah stepped forward, unable to remain silent under the implication. "Mr. North has shown me nothing but respect," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. which is more than I can say for the good people of Riverhaven, who were content to see me auctioned off like cattle." Sheriff Daniels had the decency to look away. "Nobody's here to cause trouble, Mrs. Montgomery. Just checking that all's well." "All is well," she confirmed, "and I won't be returning to Riverhaven." The finality in her tone seemed to settle the matter. After a moment of awkward silence, Sheriff Daniels touched his hat brim again. "We'll be moving on then. North, if you do see any sign of those horse thieves, you'll be the first to know," North finished, his stance unwavering until the three men turned their mounts and disappeared back into the forest. Only when the sound of their departure had faded completely did North lower the rifle. He turned to Hannah, concern evident in his gaze. "They won't be the last," he warned. "Riverhaven doesn't easily surrender what it considers its property." "I'm not property," Hannah replied, lifting her chin defiantly. "No," North agreed, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You most certainly are not." They rode back to the homestead in watchful silence, taking a different route than the one they had followed that morning. North remained vigilant, frequently scanning their surroundings for signs of pursuit. Though the encounter had ended peacefully, both understood its implications. Their fragile sanctuary had been discovered, and with discovery came threat. As twilight gathered, they reached the clearing. North insisted on checking the outbuildings and perimeter before allowing Hannah to dismount, his protective instincts heightened by the day's confrontation. When he finally helped her from the saddle, his hands lingered at her waist, a heartbeat. "Longer than necessary. Thank you," Hannah said quietly, "for defending me." North's expression softened momentarily. "You defended yourself," he pointed out. "I merely provided the rifle to emphasize your point." The unexpected humor surprised a laugh from her, easing some of the tension that had built during their cautious return journey. They cared for the horses together, working in the comfortable synchronicity they had developed over the weeks of cohabitation. Later, after a simple dinner, North sat at his desk writing in a leather-bound journal, while Hannah sorted dried herbs near the fire. The domestic scene held a peace that belied the day's confrontation, yet beneath it ran a current of awareness that what they had built here was fragile, threatened not just by outside forces, but by something growing between them, unacknowledged, but increasingly difficult to ignore. "I should tell you," North said finally, closing his journal, "why I really brought you here." Hannah looked up, surprised by the sudden confession. "I thought you had," she replied. "You said you knew I was innocent of poisoning Ezekiel." "That's true," North acknowledged, "but there's more." He stood and moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames for a long moment before continuing. "I knew your father." Hannah's fingers stilled on the herbs she'd been bundling. "What?" "James Calloway, Virginia horse breeder who came west after losing everything in the war. I served under him, 14th Virginia Cavalry." The revelation struck Hannah like a physical blow. She hadn't heard her maiden name spoken aloud in years, Ezekiel having insisted she sever all connections with her past upon their marriage. "You fought for the Confederacy?" she asked, trying to make sense of this unexpected connection. North shook his head. "Union scout captured at Cold Harbor? Your father was the officer who interviewed me." He traced the edge of the mantle with one finger, lost in memory. "He should have turned me over to be hanged as a spy. Instead, he arranged my transfer to a regular prisoner camp. Saved my life." Hannah struggled to reconcile this information with her memories of her gentle, principled father. Why would he do that? "He said no purpose was served by more death," North replied simply, "that the true measure of a man was not which side he fought for, but whether he recognized humanity in his enemy." Hannah's throat tightened with emotion. It sounded exactly like something her father would say, his quiet wisdom that had so often put him at odds with his contemporaries. "How did you know I was his daughter?" I didn't. Not until I saw you in Riverhaven last winter. You have his eyes. North's gaze met hers across the room. When I heard what had happened with your husband, how the settlement had turned against you, I remembered what your father did for me. I couldn't intervene then, but when the auction was announced, he spread his hands, the gesture conveying what words could not, an obligation honored, a debt repaid. Hannah absorbed this revelation in silence. All these weeks, she had wondered at North's motives, had assumed some combination of charity and loneliness had prompted him to claim her. The truth, that he had acted from a sense of honor, fulfilling a debt to a man long dead, was both more straightforward and more complex than she had imagined. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked finally. North's expression held a rare vulnerability. "I wanted you to stay because you chose to. Not because you felt obligated by your father's connection to me." The simple honesty of his answer touched something deep within Hannah. Gabriel North, the feared recluse of Wolf's Head Mountain, had offered her freedom in its truest form, the right to make her own choices without pressure or expectation, even when those choices might lead her away from him. "I am choosing," she said quietly, rising to face him. "Every day I choose to stay." She moved closer, drawn by the flickering light that softened the harshness of his scar, revealed the man beneath the carefully maintained reserve. "Not because of my father, because of you, who you are, what you've given me." North remained motionless as she approached, his breathing visibly controlled. When she stood before him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, he spoke, his voice rough with restrained emotion. "Hannah, I'm not a whole man. What happened with the grizzly? It took more than just flesh." She understood what he was trying to tell her, that his scars ran deeper than the visible marks on his face, that there were wounds inside him that might never fully heal. "None of us are whole," she replied softly. "We all carry damage. The question is whether we let it define us." For a long moment they stood in silence, separated by inches and yet connected by a current of understanding that transcended physical space. Then with deliberate slowness, North raised his hand and gently brushed a strand of copper hair from her cheek, his calloused fingers infinitely tender against her skin. The simple touch held more meaning than any passionate embrace. It was acceptance. Acknowledgement, the first tentative step toward something neither had dared to name. Hannah leaned into his palm slightly, permitting herself this moment of vulnerability, of connection. Outside, night had fully claimed the mountain. The wind whispered secrets to the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf's lonely howl echoed across the valleys. Inside, in the warm circle of firelight, two wounded souls began the delicate dance of healing, not through dramatic declarations or desperate passion, but through the quiet courage of seeing and being seen without judgment or expectation. The threat from Riverhaven still loomed beyond their clearing. The shadows of their respective pasts still lingered in the corners of their shared space. But in this moment, Hannah Montgomery and Gabriel North stood on the threshold of possibility, a future neither had imagined, built on the foundation of mutual respect and growing trust that had sustained them through the uncertain weeks of spring. June arrived with brutal force, bringing storms that lashed the mountains with torrential rain and searing bolts of lightning. The creek swelled beyond its banks, and trails turned to muddy ribbons, isolating North's homestead more completely than winter snows ever had. Inside the cabin, Hannah and Gabriel developed an intimacy born of close quarters and shared work. She teaching him the properties of her medicinal plants, he showing her how to repair leather harnesses and maintain tools with the same meticulous care he applied to everything. The storm that broke on the summer solstice surpassed all others in its fury. Thunder shook the cabin's sturdy logs, and, Wind screamed through the pine forest like a living entity. Hannah stood at the window, watching nature's violent display with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "The barn roof won't hold if this continues," Gabriel said, donning his oilskin coat. "The horses need to be moved." Hannah reached for her own coat. "I'm coming with you." Gabriel hesitated, concern evident in his expression, but he didn't argue. They battled their way across the yard together, leaning into the wind that threatened to knock them off their feet. Rain lashed at their faces, cold and stinging, despite the summer warmth that had preceded the storm. Inside the barn, the horses whinnied nervously as another thunderclap shook the structure. Gabriel worked quickly, securing lead ropes while Hannah calmed the animals with gentle touches and soothing words. Above them, the roof groaned ominously as a section of shingles tore free. "We'll take them to the root cellar," Gabriel shouted, over the storm's roar. "The entrance is wide enough for them to pass." They led the panicked horses across the yard, one animal each fighting against wind and rain. The root cellar, more a cave dug into the hillside behind the cabin than a true cellar, offered sanctuary from the elements. Its earthen walls and stone-reinforced entrance had withstood decades of Montana's temperamental weather. As Gabriel secured the last horse, a tremendous crack split the air, different from thunder, more immediate and threatening. Hannah turned toward the sound in time to see a massive pine, its roots weakened by days of rain, toppling directly toward the barn. "Gabriel," she screamed, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of splintering wood and howling wind as the tree crashed through the barn's roof, collapsing the structure with terrifying finality. Gabriel's arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her deeper into the shelter of the root cellar as debris scattered across the yard. For a moment they stood frozen, Gabriel's body a protective shield around her smaller frame, both of them processing how close they had come to being crushed beneath tons of timber and roofing. "Are you hurt?" Gabriel's voice was rough with concern, his hands moving to her shoulders, her face checking for injuries. Hannah shook her head, momentarily beyond words. The reality of what had just happened, how quickly life could be extinguished, left her trembling despite the relative warmth of the underground shelter. "The horses," she managed finally. "Safe," Gabriel assured her, his breathing still uneven. "And so are we." The simple declaration broke something inside Hannah, the last barrier of reserve she had maintained between them. She turned into his embrace, pressing her face against his chest, allowing the solid strength of him to anchor her against the storm's chaos, both external and internal. Gabriel's arms tightened around her, one hand coming to rest at the back of her head, cradling her against him with a tenderness that belied his strength. They remained that way as the storm raged on, finding in each other's presence a sanctuary more secure than any structure of wood or stone. When Hannah finally pulled back slightly, rain dampened and wind tousled but steadier, Gabriel looked down at her with an expression she had never seen before, openly vulnerable, the careful reserve he maintained completely absent. "I thought," he began, then stopped, apparently unable to voice the fear that had gripped him when the tree fell. Hannah reached up, her fingers tracing the edge of his scar with gentle reverence. "I know," she said softly. "So did I." Gabriel caught her hand, pressing it more firmly against his cheek in a gesture of acceptance, of her touch, of what it represented. When he bent his head to hers, the kiss they shared was hesitant at first, a question rather than a demand. Hannah answered by rising on her toes, deepening the connection, permission, and invitation in one movement. Outside, the storm began to abate, thunder receding into the distance, rain softening from violent downpour to steady patter. Inside their earthen sanctuary, surrounded by nervous horses and the scent of damp soil, Hannah and Gabriel discovered a different kind of storm, one that had been building between them since that first night in Riverhaven, now finally breaking, with quiet intensity. Later, as weak sunlight filtered through the clouds, they emerged from the root cellar to survey the damage. The barn lay in ruins, though miraculously, the cabin had escaped with only minor damage to the porch roof. They worked together to clear what debris they could, salvaging tools and tack from the wreckage. "We'll rebuild," Gabriel said simply, as if there were no question about it, as if we were an established fact rather than a fragile, newly acknowledged possibility. Hannah nodded, accepting both the practical necessity and the deeper implication of his words. Something fundamental had shifted between them, transcending the careful boundaries they had maintained. The destruction had, paradoxically, created space for building something new. That evening, as they sat before the fire, Gabriel's arm around her shoulders and her head resting against him, Hannah felt a sense of rightness that transcended conventional notions of propriety. There had been no declarations of love, no promises exchanged. They were both too pragmatic, too scarred by life's harsh lessons for such sentimentality. But there was honesty between them, and mutual respect, and a growing tenderness that needed no flowery words. "I need to go to Riverhaven tomorrow," Gabriel said, his fingers absently tracing patterns on her shoulder. "We need supplies to rebuild." Hannah tensed at the mention of the settlement. "I'll come with you," Gabriel's hand stilled. "Are you sure? After everything—" "I won't hide," Hannah interrupted, determination hardening her voice. "And I won't send you alone to face whatever Thatcher and his followers might have planned." The pride in Gabriel's eyes warmed her more than the fire's heat. "We'll take both horses," he said, "and the rifle." Morning brought clear skies and the earthy scent of renewal that follows severe storms. They prepared methodically for the journey. To Riverhaven, Gabriel checking the rifle and pistol, Hannah packing medicinal supplies that might be needed. The grey mare, now firmly Hannah's companion, nickered softly as she mounted, clearly eager for exercise after confinement. They rode in companionable silence, following rain-washed trails that wound through forests and across meadows brilliant with wildflowers. Occasionally, Gabriel would point out tracks in the mud, deer, elk, once the distinctive pawprint of a mountain lion. Hannah absorbed these small lessons eagerly, her understanding of the land's intricate ecosystems deepening with each observation. As they approached Riverhaven, the landscape changed, natural forest giving way to cleared fields and the crude road that served as the settlement's main connection to the outside world. Gabriel's posture shifted subtly, tension evident in the set of his shoulders. Hannah straightened in her saddle as well, steeling herself for whatever reception awaited them. The settlement appeared much as it had the night Gabriel had taken her away. Weathered buildings clustered around the central thoroughfare, people moving with the purposeful efficiency of frontier existence. Activity slowed as they rode down the main street, conversations dying mid-sentence, faces turning to track their progress. Gabriel guided them directly to Henderson's general store, dismounting and helping Hannah down with formal courtesy that established their relationship without need for explanation. His hand remained at the small of her back as they entered the store, a subtle but clear statement of protection. Inside, the shopkeeper, a thin man with perpetually ink-stained fingers, stared openly at their entrance. "Mr. North," he acknowledged cautiously, then with visible reluctance, "Mrs. Montgomery." "Mr. Henderson," Gabriel replied evenly. "We need supplies. Barn collapsed in yesterday's storm." Henderson nodded, professional interest temporarily overriding social discomfort. "Lost 3 chimneys in town myself. Worst storm in years." He began gathering the items Gabriel listed: nails, roofing material, tools to replace those damaged beyond repair. As Henderson calculated the total, the bell above the door jingled. Sheriff Daniels entered, followed closely by Reverend Thatcher, whose narrow face tightened with disapproval at the sight of Hannah. "North," the sheriff greeted, his tone carefully neutral. "Heard you were in town." Gabriel inclined his head slightly, his stance adjusting almost imperceptibly to place himself between Hannah and the newcomers. "Sheriff, Reverend," Thatcher made, no pretense of civility. "This is most inappropriate," he declared, glaring at Hannah, "a respectable woman living unchaperoned with a man to whom she is not wed. The scandal has reached as far as Helena." Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment but indignation. "My arrangements are my own concern, Reverend, not yours, nor Helena's. The moral fabric of this territory is everyone's concern," Thatcher countered, his voice taking on the cadence he used for sermons. "When sin is flaunted so openly—" "Careful, Reverend," Gabriel interrupted, his voice dangerously soft. "You're approaching slander." Thatcher's face flushed with righteous fervor. "The truth cannot be slander, Mr. North. And the truth is that Mrs. Montgomery has been living in sin since you purchased her contract. Rescued her," Gabriel corrected, steel beneath the quiet words, "from an unjust situation Riverhaven created." Sheriff Daniels stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension. "Let's keep things civil, gentlemen. North, your business here is nearly concluded," Gabriel finished, placing coins on the counter to pay Henderson. "We'll be leaving as soon as our supplies are loaded." Thatcher wasn't finished. "There's another matter," he said, producing a folded document from his coat pocket. "This arrived from the territorial magistrate yesterday. It seems Mrs. Montgomery's late husband had a brother in St. Louis who contests the sale of her contract, claims prior rights as next of kin." Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. Ezekiel had mentioned a brother once or twice, a man he described as more ruthless than himself, from whom he had borrowed money he never repaid. The idea that this unseen relative could claim authority over her future sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the store's temperature. Gabriel took the document, scanning it with narrowed eyes. "This has no legal standing," he said finally. "Her husband's debts were settled in full. The contract was properly witnessed and executed. The territorial court may see things differently," Thatcher replied with thinly veiled satisfaction. "Family ties often supersede financial arrangements in these matters. Mr. Montgomery's brother is expected to arrive within the week to press his claim. The sheriff will be obliged to escort Mrs. Montgomery back to town when he does." Hannah stepped forward, her spine straight, despite the fear coursing through her. "I am not property to be claimed or contested," she said, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. "I am a free woman who has chosen where and how to live." "The law may not see it that way," Thatcher countered. "Women in your position, without male relatives to speak for them, are considered wards of the territory, subject to proper placement." Gabriel's hand came to rest at the small of Hannah's back again, a silent reminder of his presence, his support. "The law also recognizes marriage," he said quietly, "which supersedes all prior claims." Hannah turned to look at him, surprise momentarily overriding her anger at Thatcher's smug pronouncement. Gabriel's eyes met hers, a question in their grey depths despite the certainty of his tone. It was not how either of them might have imagined such a moment, standing in Henderson's dusty store with hostile witnesses, but Hannah recognized the practical necessity behind the impromptu proposal, as well as the genuine sentiment beneath the pragmatic exterior. Her answer was for Gabriel alone, though spoken where others could hear. "Yes," she said simply, "though I would have preferred you asked me on our own terms, not theirs." The ghost of a smile touched Gabriel's lips. "I'll ask properly once we're home," he promised softly. Thatcher spluttered indignantly. "This is outrageous, a transparent attempt to circumvent proper authority. The magistrate will never— Judge Hollister owes me a favor," Gabriel interrupted, his attention never leaving Hannah's face, despite addressing the Reverend. He's riding circuit near Wolf Creek. We'll meet him there tomorrow. Sheriff Daniels cleared his throat. That would settle the legal matter, Reverend. A properly officiated marriage by a territorial judge can't be contested by distant relatives. Thatcher's face contorted with frustrated rage. This is a mockery of the sacred institution of matrimony. No, Reverend, Hannah replied calmly. It's a choice freely made between two people who respect each other, something I never had in my first marriage. The pointed reminder of Ezekiel's less-than-exemplary character silenced Thatcher momentarily. Gabriel used the opportunity to complete their transaction with Henderson, arranging for the supplies to be brought out to their horses. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Daniels approached, speaking low enough that only they could hear. Montgomery's brother isn't what you'd call a reasonable man. Arrived yesterday, actually. Been drinking at the saloon since, making threats. You'd best be careful on the ride home. Gabriel nodded, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Appreciated, Sheriff. Outside, Hannah waited until they had mounted and ridden beyond the settlement's boundaries before speaking. Did you mean it? She asked, drawing her horse alongside Gabriel's. About the marriage? Gabriel looked at her directly, all pretense of detachment absent from his gaze. I meant it, he confirmed, though I'd have preferred different circumstances. For asking. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I want you with me, Hannah, not because of your father's kindness to me, not because of Riverhaven's injustice, but because of who you are, who we are together. The simple honesty of his declaration moved Hannah more deeply than flowery protestations could have. She recognized in his words the same straightforward integrity that had drawn her to him from the beginning, a man who spoke truth as he saw it, without embellishment or evasion. Then yes, she said again, this time with no audience but the Montana sky and the wildflowers nodding in the summer breeze. I choose you, Gabriel North, as you chose me. Wolf Creek Trading Post appeared through the morning mist, a cluster of log buildings offering rare civilization in the vast Montana wilderness. Hannah and Gabriel approached warily, their horses weary from the difficult journey through unfamiliar territory. Judge Hollister should be here, Gabriel said, as they dismounted outside the main building. Stay close, we don't know who else might be. Inside, the trading post buzzed with frontier commerce, trappers bartering pelts, miners purchasing supplies, travelers seeking respite from the isolation of mountain trails. The proprietor, a grizzled man with a magnificent beard and one clouded eye, recognized Gabriel with a curt nod. North. Been a while. Burke, Gabriel acknowledged. We need to see Judge Hollister. Urgent business. Burke's good eye assessed Hannah, briefly. Legal business, I reckon. Judge is in the back room. He leaned closer, voice dropping. Should warn you, some men came through yesterday asking after a scarred rancher and a red-haired woman. Had the Montgomery name. Hannah's heart quickened. Ezekiel's brother had tracked them faster than anticipated. Gabriel's hand moved instinctively to his pistol. How long ago? He asked, headed toward Riverhaven when they couldn't get answers here. Might be back. Burke reached beneath the counter and produced a key. Room upstairs if you need it. Judge typically starts hearings at dawn. The small room Burke provided offered minimal comfort, a narrow bed, washstand and single chair, but the door had a sturdy bolt. Gabriel insisted on keeping watch while Hannah rested, his vigilance a physical manifestation of his protective commitment. When Hannah awoke from a fitful sleep, she found Gabriel standing at the window, rifle within reach, shoulders tense with unrelenting watchfulness. You need rest too, she said softly. I'll rest when you're safe, he replied, not turning from his vigil. If we're to be married tomorrow, shouldn't we start with honesty? Hannah moved to stand beside him. I'm not. Fragile, Gabriel. We face this together or not at all. His expression softened as he looked down at her, Old habits, he conceded. I've been alone a long time. Not anymore, she reminded him. Morning brought Judge Hollister, a tall, dignified man whose white hair and weathered face testified to decades dispensing frontier justice. He examined their situation with cool efficiency, reviewing the documents from Riverhaven and listening to their account with attentive impartiality. These widow contracts create more problems than they solve, he observed, though in this case it appears to have led to a fortuitous meeting. His piercing blue eyes studied them thoughtfully. You understand, Mrs. Montgomery, that marriage to Mr. North will legally sever any claims your late husband's family might make. I do, Hannah confirmed, and it's what I choose, freely and without reservation. Mr. North, the judge continued, you accept responsibility for any debts or obligations from her previous marriage? I do, Gabriel replied without hesitation. Though I maintain those debts were settled in full when I purchased her contract, Judge Hollister nodded, satisfied. I've seen marriages formed for many reasons in this territory, convenience, necessity, property, but the ones that endure are built on mutual respect. He smiled slightly. You two have that foundation at least. The ceremony took place in Burke's office, simple and unadorned. No flowers, no music, no rings, just honest words spoken with genuine intent. Burke and his wife served as witnesses, standing solemnly as Hannah and Gabriel exchanged vows that transformed legal necessity into sacred promise. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, Judge Hollister concluded, I now pronounce you husband and wife. When Gabriel looked at Hannah in that moment, she saw something in his grey eyes she'd never witnessed before. Hope, unguarded and vulnerable. His hand found hers, calloused fingers entwining with her smaller ones in silent acknowledgement of their shared future. The judge presented them with the signed marriage certificate. This is now legally binding throughout the territory. Keep. It's safe. It supersedes any prior claims on Mrs. North's person or property. Mrs. North. The name settled over Hannah like a mantle freely chosen rather than imposed. A smile touched her lips, reflected in Gabriel's rare expression of unguarded contentment. Their moment of peace shattered with the crash of the trading post's front door and the unmistakable voice of Ezekiel's brother, Silas Montgomery. Where are they? He demanded, voice slurred with whiskey and sharp with entitlement. The witch and her scarred protector. I know they're here. Burke's wife reacted swiftly, guiding them toward a back exit. Your horses are ready, she whispered. Go now! Gabriel positioned himself between Hannah and the connecting door, drawing his pistol. Get to the horses, he instructed. I'll follow. Hannah hesitated, unwilling to leave him facing danger alone. Trust me, he said simply. 3 words, but after everything they'd shared, they were enough. Hannah nodded and slipped through the door, following Mrs. Burke through the kitchen toward the waiting horses. She had just reached her mare when the door burst open behind her. Turning, she faced Silas Montgomery for the first time, her late husband's features distorted by cruelty and greed, a pistol aimed unsteadily at her chest. Found you, he sneered, my brother's runaway property. Hannah stood her ground, one hand on her horse's bridle. I belong to no one, Silas, especially not you. That's not how the law sees it, he countered, advancing. A widow's debts transfer to the nearest male relative. Basic frontier justice. Not anymore. Hannah straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. I'm legally married to Gabriel North. Judge Hollister performed the ceremony himself this morning. Your claim is void. Rage transformed Silas's face. You lying whore, he snarled, lunging toward her. Hannah sidestepped his grasp, drawing the small herb knife Gabriel had given her. Before she could use it, the unmistakable sound of a revolver being cocked froze Silas in place. My wife spoke. The truth, Gabriel said from the doorway, his voice dangerously calm. We're legally married. Your claim is void. Leave now, and you'll leave breathing." Silas turned slowly, recognizing the deadly intent in Gabriel's stance. For a tense moment, Hannah feared he might still attempt violence. Ezekiel's brother had always been more reckless, more volatile. But self-preservation won out. Silas lowered his weapon, though his eyes promised future retribution. "This isn't over," he spat. "It is," Judge Hollister contradicted, appearing behind Gabriel with Burke and two other men. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm confiscating your weapon and warning you that any further harassment of Mr. and Mrs. North will result in charges. The marriage is legal and binding. Your claim is nullified." Defeated but unrepentant, Silas surrendered his pistol. "The witch killed my brother," he muttered. "Everyone in River Haven knows it." "Your brother died of heart failure brought on by years of excessive drinking," Hannah replied evenly. A fact conveniently overlooked by those who found it easier to blame a woman with knowledge of herbs than acknowledge the truth about a man they called friend. Judge Hollister nodded to Burke and his companions, who escorted the protesting Silas away. When they were gone, the judge turned to Gabriel and Hannah. "I suggest you leave immediately," he advised. "While he's detained. Men like that rarely accept defeat gracefully." Gabriel helped Hannah mount her mare, his hands lingering protectively at her waist. "Thank you, Judge, for everything." "Justice isn't always found in law books," Hollister replied with a knowing smile. "Sometimes it requires seeing what's right beyond what's written." "Safe journey, Mr. and Mrs. North." They rode away from Wolf Creek Trading Post as morning sun dispersed the lingering mist, taking a different trail than the one they'd arrived on. Gabriel remained vigilant, frequently scanning their surroundings for signs of pursuit. Hannah rode beside him, equal partner in their escape, in their future. "What now?" she asked as they paused to rest the horses near a mountain stream. Gabriel's eyes met hers, holding a mixture of determination and tenderness. "Now we go home," he said simply. "Rebuild the barn, tend the garden, live our lives together." Home. The word held a resonance Hannah hadn't felt since childhood. Not just a place of shelter, but of belonging, of choice. And riding beside her was a man who had offered her not rescue, but partnership, not protection as possession, but protection as respect. As they continued their journey toward the mountain homestead, Hannah Montgomery North realized that what had begun as desperate flight from injustice had transformed into something extraordinary, a marriage unlike any she had witnessed on the frontier, a union where strength was measured not by domination but by mutual support, where a scarred rancher and a witch had found in each other's wounded spirits the courage to begin again, to define family on their own terms. Ahead lay challenges, Silas's, threats, River Haven's judgment, the unforgiving demands of frontier survival. But for the first time since her father's death, Hannah faced the future not with resignation, but with resolve, riding beside a man who saw her clearly and valued her for exactly who she was. The Montana wilderness stretched before them, vast and indifferent to human concerns. But within that vastness, Gabriel and Hannah North had claimed their own territory, not just of land, but of possibility. A home built not from desperation, but from choice. Not from necessity, but from respect. And in a world that rarely offered second chances, they had found perhaps the rarest gift of all, the freedom to write their own story. "Well, well," he drawled, leveling a pistol at her chest. "The witch herself. Didn't think you'd be fool enough to run from me, Hannah." Hannah stood her ground, one hand resting on her mare's flank to steady both the nervous animal and herself. "I'm not running, Silas," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "and I'm not yours to claim." Silas advanced, his boots crunching on the gravel. "That's where you're wrong, darling. My brother's debts belong to me, and that includes you." His gaze raked over her with insulting thoroughness. "Though I can see why he kept you around, despite your peculiarities. Hannah's fingers found the knife concealed in her coat pocket, a small blade Gabriel had given her for gathering herbs, not much of a weapon, but it gave her courage to know it was there. "Ezekiel is dead," she said clearly. "His debts were settled in full by Mr. North, and as of this morning I am Mrs. Gabriel North, legally wed before Judge Hollister with proper witnesses. You have no claim on me." Silas's expression darkened. "You lying whore," he spat. "You think some backwater judge and a piece of paper will stop me? Ezekiel owed me a fortune. If I can't have it in cash, I'll take it out in other ways." He lunged forward, grabbing for her arm. Hannah sidestepped, drawing the small knife and holding it before her. "Don't touch me," she warned. Silas laughed, an ugly sound devoid of humor. "What are you going to do with that little toothpick, Hannah? Cut me? Then what? You'll hang for murder just like you should have when you poisoned my brother." "She didn't poison anyone." Gabriel's voice came from behind Silas, deadly calm and accompanied by the unmistakable sound of a revolver being cocked. "And if you touch my wife, you'll never leave this trading post alive." Silas froze, his own gun still pointed at Hannah. "Your wife," he sneered, not turning, "as if that means anything. She was Ezekiel's property, and now she's mine." "Hannah belongs to no one but herself," Gabriel replied, his tone unchanged, but somehow more dangerous for its restraint. "The law recognizes our marriage. Your claim is void." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Silas's shoulders sagged slightly, his gun lowering a fraction. "Fine," he muttered. "Keep the bitch, but this isn't over, North, not by a long shot." "It is over." Judge Hollister's authoritative voice joined the confrontation. He stood in the kitchen doorway, official papers in hand. "Mr. Montgomery, I am confiscating your weapon and placing you under temporary arrest for threatening a married woman with a firearm." Silas's face contorted with fury. "You have no right." "I have every right," Hollister interrupted. "I am the circuit judge for this district, and I will not tolerate such behavior in my jurisdiction." He gestured to two men who had appeared beside him, Burke and another trader, both armed. "Your gun, please." Outmaneuvered and outnumbered, Silas reluctantly surrendered his pistol. His glare, when it found Hannah again, contained such malevolence that she instinctively stepped back. "This changes nothing," he hissed. "You're still the woman who killed my brother. And someday, when you least expect it—" "That's enough," Gabriel interrupted, moving to Hannah's side. His revolver remained trained on Silas until Burke and his companion secured the man's arms. "Judge, we'll be filing formal charges of attempted assault and issuing a legal warning against any further contact." Hollister nodded gravely. "I'll see it recorded. In the meantime, I suggest you and Mrs. North depart, while Mr. Montgomery cools his heels in Burke's storeroom until the next eastbound stage." Gabriel holstered his weapon and turned to Hannah, his grey eyes searching her face. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, still clutching the small knife. "No, just ready to leave." With Burke and the judge ensuring Silas couldn't interfere, they mounted their horses and rode away from the trading post, taking a little-used trail that would eventually connect with the route to Gabriel's homestead. They rode in tense silence for several miles, both processing the confrontation and its implications. Finally, as they paused to water the horses at a small stream, Hannah voiced the fear that had been growing since their encounter with Silas. "He won't stop, will he?" "Not really." Gabriel's expression was grim but honest. "Men like Silas Montgomery rarely accept defeat," he acknowledged. "But we have the law on our side now, and distance." He looked at the mountains rising before them, their homestead nestled somewhere in those protective heights. "Few men are desperate enough to challenge us on our own ground." Hannah considered this, weighing the threat against the life they were building. "Then we continue as planned," she decided. "Rebuild the barn, tend the garden, live our lives." Gabriel's expression softened into one of those rare, genuine smiles that transformed his scarred face. "Yes," he agreed. "We live our lives together." They resumed their journey, the summer sun warm on their backs, the mountain breeze carrying, the scent of pine and wildflowers. As the terrain grew steeper, more familiar, Hannah felt the tension of the past days beginning to ease. Whatever threat still lurked beyond the horizon, this land and the man who rode beside her had become home in the truest sense. Near dusk, they crested the final ridge that overlooked Gabriel's, their, homestead. The clearing lay peaceful. In the golden evening light, the damaged barn already seeming less catastrophic from this distance, the cabin solid and welcoming. Gabriel reined his horse to a stop, and Hannah drew alongside him. "Not what most women would want for a wedding trip," he observed, a hint of apology in his tone. Hannah looked out over the valley that had, in just a few short months, become more, truly her home, than anywhere she had lived since childhood. "It's exactly what I want," she replied with quiet certainty. As they descended toward the cabin, the first stars appeared overhead, eternal witnesses to the human dramas played out beneath. Their indifferent light, Hannah thought of all the twists of fate that had brought her here. Her father's death, her disastrous marriage to Ezekiel, the accusations after his death, the auction that had seemed like the final humiliation, but had instead led to unexpected salvation. Not rescue, she corrected herself, partnership, for that was what Gabriel had offered from the beginning. Beneath his gruff exterior and behind his protective instincts, the chance to stand beside him rather than behind him, to be valued for her knowledge and strength rather than merely tolerated for her usefulness. They reached the cabin as full. Darkness settled over the mountain. Gabriel helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. The touch was different now, still respectful, but with a new possessiveness that Hannah found she welcomed rather than resented. "Welcome home, Mrs. North," he said softly. In those 3 words lay a promise more binding than their hasty vows before Judge Hollister. A commitment to build something together that neither of them had thought possible after their respective losses and disillusionments. A second chance, not just at happiness, but at becoming the people they were meant to be, free from others' judgments and expectations. Hannah reached up, her fingers tracing the edges of the scar that had once made others fear Gabriel, but which she now saw as simply another facet of the man she had chosen. "Home," she agreed. "At last." The cabin door closed behind them, shutting out the darkness and whatever threats it might hold. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the barn to rebuild, a garden to tend, perhaps someday a community to forge with like-minded settlers who valued independence and mutual respect. But tonight belonged to them alone, a scarred rancher, and a witch whom no one had dared to love, finding in each other's wounded spirits the courage to begin again, to define family on their own terms, to build a sanctuary where judgment gave way to understanding and possession was replaced by partnership. Outside, the Montana wilderness continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human concerns. But within the circle of light cast by their hearth fire, Hannah and Gabriel North had created something both rare and precious on the American frontier. A marriage of equals, a union based not on necessity or convention, but on the revolutionary concept that a man and woman might face the world side by side, stronger together than apart, each recognizing in the other a worth that transcended society's narrow definitions of value. They continued riding, the horses picking their way carefully, along the rain-damaged trail. Around them, the wilderness stretched vast and indifferent to human concerns, yet somehow it seemed to Hannah that the land itself approved of their decision. This partnership forged not from desperation or convenience, but from genuine understanding and mutual respect. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Gabriel suddenly reined his horse to a halt, his expression sharpening. Hannah followed his gaze to a stand of aspens ahead, where a flash of metal had caught the sunlight, a rifle barrel, hastily withdrawn. "Ambush," Gabriel said quietly, reaching for his own weapon. "3 men, maybe 4. Go back the way we came. As fast as you can." Hannah shook her head, already turning her mare toward a different path, a game trail that branched from the main road, winding through thicker forest. "This way," she said with quiet authority. "I know these woods from when I gathered herbs for Riverhaven. There's a creek crossing half a mile ahead where we can lose them." Gabriel hesitated only a moment before following her lead. Recognition of her expertise overriding male pride. They urged their horses into a controlled trot, not fast enough to risk injury on the rough terrain, but quick enough to put distance between themselves and the waiting ambush. Behind them came shouts and the sound of horses crashing through underbrush. Their departure had been noticed. Hannah led them deeper into the forest, navigating by landmarks only a trained eye would recognize: a lightning-scarred pine, a distinctive outcropping of rock, a clearing where specific medicinal plants grew. The creek, when they reached it, ran high and swift with recent rainfall. Hannah didn't hesitate, guiding her mare into the water and upstream, Gabriel following close behind. The cold current reached the horses' bellies, slowing their progress but effectively eliminating tracks. They traveled this way for nearly a quarter-mile before Hannah directed them back to the bank, choosing a rocky section that would leave minimal evidence of their exit. Only when they had put another mile between themselves and the creek did they pause to rest the horses and assess their situation. "Ezekiel's brother?" Hannah asked. Though she already knew the answer, Gabriel nodded grimly. "And hired guns, most likely. The sheriff warned us in his way." He scanned the forest around them, alert for any sign of pursuit. "We need to reach Judge Hollister before they find us. A legal marriage is our best protection." Hannah understood the urgency. Without the judge's authority, Gabriel's claim on her, even with the settled contract, remained vulnerable to challenge, especially from blood relatives of her deceased husband. The ambush proved how desperate Ezekiel's brother was to reclaim what he saw as family property, whether out of genuine belief in his rights or, more likely, to punish Hannah for perceived wrongs. "There's a trading post on the Wolf Creek Road," she said, recalling the regional geography from her herb-gathering expeditions. "If we cut across the ridge, we could reach it by nightfall. The owner might know where the judge is staying." Gabriel studied her with newfound appreciation. "You know this land better than I realized." "I had to," Hannah replied simply. Gathering in secret meant finding paths Riverhaven wouldn't think to watch. She didn't elaborate on the risks she had taken during her marriage to maintain her connection to her grandmother's traditions, the ways she had carved out small freedoms within her confinement. As the afternoon waned, they pushed onward, following Hannah's guidance through increasingly rugged terrain. The ridge she had mentioned proved challenging, a steep, rocky slope that forced them to dismount and lead the horses carefully along narrow game trails. By the time they reached the summit, the sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the vast Montana landscape. From this elevation, Hannah could see for miles, forested slopes rolling away toward distant mountains, the silver thread of Wolf Creek in the valley below, and nestled beside it, the small cluster of buildings that marked the trading post. Beyond that lay uncertainty, but also possibility, a future shaped by choice rather than coercion, partnership rather than ownership. Gabriel came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with natural ease. Together they gazed out at the territory, spread before them, wild, demanding, but offering something precious few places in America still could, the chance to define oneself on one's own terms, to build a life measured by personal integrity rather than social convention. "Ready?" Gabriel asked, the single word encompassing far more than the immediate journey down the ridge. Hannah squeezed his hand, drawing strength from the connection. "Ready?" she affirmed. The sun slipped lower as they began their descent, bathing the world in golden light. Behind them, somewhere in the gathering shadows, pursuers searched with increasingly frustrated determination. Ahead lay Wolf Creek, Judge Hollister, and legal sanctuary. But in this moment, suspended between past and future, Hannah Montgomery felt something she had nearly forgotten existed. The fierce joy of self-determination, the exhilaration of choosing her own path, and the quiet certainty that whatever came next, she would face it not alone, but alongside a man who saw her clearly and valued her for exactly who she was. Autumn painted the Montana highlands in fiery glory, aspen groves shimmering gold against evergreen slopes, mountain meadows, burnished copper beneath cerulean skies. 3 months had passed since Hannah and Gabriel's hasty wedding at Wolf Creek Trading Post, a season of rebuilding and quiet transformation. The new barn stood complete, its sturdy frame testament to Gabriel's craftsmanship and Hannah's unexpected skill with architectural planning. Her suggestion to incorporate a root cellar beneath the structure had proven ingenious, providing storage for her expanding collection of medicinal herbs and the summer's garden harvest. On this particular morning, Hannah sat on the porch steps, sorting juniper berries gathered from the surrounding forest. The mountain air carried the first hint of winter's approach, crisp enough to redden her cheeks, but not yet bitter. From the corral came the rhythmic sound of Gabriel training the yearling colt, his low voice a constant murmur of encouragement and correction. So much had changed since that spring evening when River Haven had auctioned her like unwanted property. The bruised, frightened widow who had ridden away on Gabriel's horse existed now only in memory, replaced by a woman who stood firmly on her own strength while choosing to share her life with a man who valued that strength. The sound of approaching hoofbeats brought Hannah to her feet, hand instinctively reaching for the small pistol Gabriel had taught her to use. Visitors were rare at their remote homestead, and memories of Silas Montgomery's threats remained vivid despite Judge Hollister's legal intervention. Gabriel appeared from the corral, rifle in hand, positioning himself between the cabin and the approaching rider. His protective instinct remained, but it had evolved, no longer assuming Hannah needed sheltering, but standing as her partner in facing whatever might come. The rider who emerged from the tree line wasn't Silas or any of his hired men, but Sheriff Daniels from River Haven. He rode alone, his posture suggesting an official visit rather than hostile intent. "North," he greeted, dismounting stiffly. "Mrs. North." Hannah moved to stand beside Gabriel, their shoulders nearly touching. "Sheriff," she acknowledged, "a long ride from River Haven. Official business," Daniels explained, removing his hat. "Thought you should know. Silas Montgomery won't be troubling you anymore." Gabriel's stance remained wary. "Explain." "Got himself killed in a saloon fight in Helena last week. Apparently accused the wrong man of cheating at cards." The sheriff seemed almost embarrassed by the simple resolution to what had loomed as a persistent threat. "Territorial judge asked me to inform you since there had been previous incidents." Relief washed through Hannah, though she kept her expression composed. "Thank you for bringing word, Sheriff. Would you care for coffee before your return journey?" The invitation surprised Daniels, who glanced uncertainly between them. Gabriel, after a moment's hesitation, nodded. "Least we can offer for the ride. You've made," this small civility, the offering of frontier hospitality to a man who had once stood by while Hannah was auctioned, marked how far they had come. Not forgetting, but moving forward. Building rather than avenging. Over coffee in the cabin, Gabriel had expanded with Hannah's help, adding a proper bedroom and enlarging the kitchen. Daniels delivered his second piece of news. "Reverend Thatcher has left River Haven," he said, warming his hands around the mug. Called to a congregation back east, he claims, though some say it had more to do with certain improprieties coming to light. Hannah raised an eyebrow, remembering the Reverend's self-righteous condemnation. Providence has a peculiar sense of justice. Indeed, ma'am, Daniels agreed. Settlements changed since you left. New doctor arrived last month. Young woman trained back east. Quite shocking to some, but she's proven herself capable. A female physician. Hannah's interest was genuine. Perhaps I should introduce myself. My herbal knowledge might complement her medical training. Gabriel watched her with quiet pride. Where once she might have hidden her skills to avoid suspicion, Hannah now spoke of them openly, confident in their value. Daniels departed shortly after, leaving behind an unexpected gift, closure. With Silas dead and Thatcher gone, the shadows from Riverhaven that had haunted their early months together dissipated like morning mist before strengthening sun. That evening, as golden light bathed the mountain slopes in farewell radiance, Hannah and Gabriel stood surveying their homestead. The rebuilt barn, the expanded cabin, the well-tended garden now put to bed beneath protective mulch for the coming winter. "I'm thinking about a greenhouse," Hannah said, gesturing toward a sunny slope, "for growing medicinal herbs year-round. Maybe establish connections with that new doctor." Gabriel smiled, the expression transforming his scarred face into something Hannah found increasingly beautiful in its honesty. "Planning to civilize the wilderness, Mrs. North?" "Not civilize," she corrected, leaning against his solid warmth. "Harmonize. There's wisdom in these mountains that most settlers never bother to discover." As twilight deepened around them, they remained on the porch, watching the first stars pierce the darkening sky. No words were needed between them now. Their partnership had grown beyond the necessity of constant verbal affirmation. A wolf howled. In the distant forest, the sound echoing across the valley, wild, free, uncompromising, like the couple who had found in each other not completion but complementary strength, not rescue but mutual respect, not ownership but partnership. The woman no one had dared to love had found not just a man brave enough to stand against an entire settlement for her, but the courage to stand for herself. And in doing so, had created something extraordinary on the American frontier, a marriage of equals in a time when such things were barely imaginable. Behind them, lamplight glowed warmly through the cabin windows, beckoning them toward home, there. Home, built by choice and defended by love. Ahead, winter approached with inevitable certainty, yet held no terror for those who had weathered far worse storms and emerged stronger together. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.